Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Josh Sharfstein. I am the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Welcome to this panel discussion called Separated Children at the Border, a Health and Human Rights Perspective. It's going to be a very important and interesting a panel, and I'm very pleased to be here and to do some introductions and help moderate the questions. I'll be moderating the questions with Monica Vasquez Guerrero, who is the Executive Director of Centro Sol here at Johns Hopkins University, and a recent graduate of the school with a fellowship from the Bloomberg American Health Initiative. To set the stage, I want to go through how we got here a little bit, a brief timeline. In March 2017, John Kelly, then Secretary of Homeland Security, confirmed a report that the administration is thinking about separating families at the border. He told CNN at the time that it would, quote, deter more movement along this terribly dangerous network. Some of this timeline comes from a great summary in USA Today. The next month, in April, Kelly said that they would only be separated if the child's life is in danger. There was not a lot of attention in 2017, although we later found out that separations started around October 2017. And in December, immigration advocacy organizations filed a joint complaint about family separation with the Department of Homeland Security. The attention really started to focus in April 2018 after the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced a quote, zero tolerance policy at the border and directed federal prosecutors to criminally prosecute all adult migrants entering the country illegally. This led to the separation of families because children could not be held in such a detention facility with their parents. But just a week later, the Homeland Security Secretary, Nielsen, testified that there was no policy for family separation. And she said, and I'm quoting, the standard in every case is to keep the family together as long as operationally possible. On April 20th, 2018, this year, the New York Times published a major report that said 700 children have been taken from their parents since October, 100 of those under the age of 4. Very soon after, the Attorney General again reiterated that he intended to prosecute every adult who crossed the border illegally. He said that this will require the government to separate children from the adults traveling with them. And right afterwards, the Chief of Staff to the President said the same thing. By May 15th, the Secretary of Homeland Security was defending the separation of children in front of a Senate committee. She said that anyone, this is her quote, anyone who breaks the law will be prosecuted. And even on June 14th, the Attorney General defended the policy by citing a biblical passage from Apostle Paul to the Romans. And saying that orderly and lawful processes are good in of themselves and protect the weak. And the president's press secretary said that he is simply enforcing the law and that they had no discretion. Also on June 14th, when that happened, the dean of the School of Public Health here, Ellen McKenzie, and several other faculty wrote a statement saying that the harsh treatment of children at the border will affect their health and their lives for many years to come. The trauma to their parents is also devastating, and the lasting consequences to thousands of families will be profound. She also said that these family separations violate the most widely ratified of all human rights conventions, the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and said that the school stood with the organizations working to reverse the policy. That statement was part of a national outcry against family separations at the border, an outcry that eventually led the administration to reverse its position that there was nothing it could do, and later President Trump signed an executive order designed to keep migrant families together. At that time, it was said that 2,342 children were separated at the border just from May 5th to June 9th alone in 2018. As you may know, it's been very challenging to reunite many of the families. There were a number of news articles about the fact that there are still hundreds of children who have not been reunited. And just in the last 2 weeks, I'll just mention three major stories. One, on September 1st in the New York Times, described the anguished wait, that's a direct quote, for children's return in parts of Guatemala where the parents were sent back to while their children remained in detention in the United States. Then on September 9th, there was an announcement that the administration was rethinking the Flores settlement, which would allow it to detain many more children than they'd ever had before, indefinitely. And then most recently, on September 12th, the New York Times reported that the detention of migrant children has skyrocketed to the highest levels ever, with a total of 12,800 this month. That's not family separations, that's the total number of children who are detained. So among all those detained are those who are still waiting to reunite with their families, as well as the direction of federal immigration policy towards more detention of children. So this is not a issue of the past. This is something that is very relevant to families in the United States now and families that are now split up. So to have this discussion, we have a tremendous group of people here, and what we're going to do is hear from each of them briefly and then have question and answers and discussions. I hope you all have index cards that's in the room. We will collect them, and Monica and I will go through and ask the questions. We do this because we are webcasting, and it's much better for the webcast to have all the questions asked in rapid succession right here at the front. Let me introduce who we have. I will start with Dr. Colleen Kraft, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Kraft is a pediatrician who received her undergraduate degree at Virginia Tech and her physician's license from her medical school training at Virginia Commonwealth University. She is focused in her year as American Academy of Pediatrics president on translating the goals of health equity into medical practice. I don't think when she started in January she really knew what she was getting herself into when it came to some of these issues, but she's been the American Academy of Pediatrics, of which I am a member, I'll say, has really been one of the leading voices on this question of family separation. In addition, we are very pleased to have Eric Schwartz, the president of Refugee International, here with us. Eric has a 3-decade career focused on humanitarian and human rights issues. Between 2009 and 2011, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. He was also the senior human rights and humanitarian official at the National Security Council in the Clinton administration. We are really glad to have back George Escobar, the Chief of Program and Services at CASA de Maryland. CASA is the Mid-Atlantic region's largest immigrant serving and advocacy organization with over 90,000 members in 3 states. Mr. Escobar oversees the service programming, including legal assistance, naturalization support, employment, workforce development, education, case management, and health education initiatives. He is as smart about policy as he is passionate about advocacy, and he has really been a tremendous collaborator with the school. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Paul Spiegel, the director of the Center for Humanitarian Health here at the School of Public Health. A physician by training, Dr. Spiegel is internationally recognized for his research on preventing and responding to complex humanitarian emergencies. Before coming to the school, he was the Deputy Director of the Division of Program Management and Support Services for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. and previously he's worked at the Centers for Disease Control and with numerous aid and relief organizations. So we really have a tremendous group to talk, and I'm going to turn first to Dr. Kraft, I believe. Is that right? No. Oh, Eric. We are going to go to Eric Schwartz, whose organization recently published a fascinating report about what is actually going on at the border.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important session. Refugees International recently, indeed, completed a mission to the U.S.-Mexico border, a mission in which I participated, and much of what I have to say will be drawn from the report that we authored. I will focus on these broad policy and political issues that have given rise to family separation, given the expertise in public health that is elsewhere on this panel. Indeed, family separation can only be understood as an outgrowth and part and parcel of a set of policies that run roughshod over basic humanitarian principles. If I may quote and paraphrase from our own report, the Trump administration is engaged in a sustained campaign against vulnerable women, men, and children who are seeking asylum in the United States. It's an effort that has been waged through policies and activities designed to deter individuals from seeking protection and to close off avenues for asylum. The campaign has created needless suffering, and the administration's demonization of asylum seekers has mischaracterized and disadvantaged the asylum seeker population. We have reported on the violence, on the persecution, and the trauma experienced by asylum seekers from Central America's Northern Triangle, which includes Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And we further, and that documentation is important because it gives the lie to the notion that those who are fleeing somehow are not in fear of the circumstances from which they have come. We've further documented the many and the varied ways that the administration has sought to choke off reasonable access to asylum for these beleaguered populations. This has included blocking access at ports of entry by simply telling asylum seekers they may not apply for asylum, or telling asylum seekers that they must return to at another point in time where there purportedly may be more processing capacity, when there purportedly may be more processing capacity. These measures, of course, have risked driving asylum seekers toward more treacherous crossings outside of ports of entry, where they face a range of risks, and if they're apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol, are arrested and criminally prosecuted in violation of international refugee law to which the United States has acceded. Deterrence measures have also included widespread detention of credible asylum claimants, pressures to self-deport against those who are in detention, and unreasonable actions by the Attorney General to narrow the legal grounds for asylum. I'll just move the podium. I'll move it back. The president's contempt for the principle of refuge for those fleeing persecution has been reflected in many statements. This isn't a secret. But I think one excerpt from the president's Twitter account is illustrative when he said, and I quote, "When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came." End of quote. In fact, this is decidedly not what we must do, nor is it what we should do, nor is it consistent with U.S. International legal obligations or consistent with U.S. domestic law. So let me get back now to the family separation issue and where we are now. The policy, as you know, was implemented in the spring through criminal prosecution and incarceration of asylum seekers traveling with children. After this public outcry, the president issued an executive order ending the practice, though he really didn't need to issue an executive order to implement a policy he was never compelled to move forward on in the first place. But there are still more than 200 children who remain separated from the adults who brought them to the United States. What is perhaps most troubling about the executive order is that it envisions replacement of a policy of family separation with a policy of family detention. At this point, however, due to court settlement reached during the Obama administration, known as the Flores settlement, such detention beyond 20 days is not permitted. However, the Trump administration is aggressively seeking relief, if I can use that term, not really the right term, from that restriction. And some members of, and are doing so, as I say, in a very assertive way. And some members of Congress are supporting legislative measures to authorize long-term family detention and effectively vacate the Flores settlement. As was mentioned, in a highly related matter, the numbers of unaccompanied minors who are now in detention in the United States has skyrocketed to over 12,000, due in some measure to the slowing down of the movement of such minors to sponsors. I think there are grave cause for concern about whether that dramatic increase is also part and parcel of this policy of deterrence. The bad news, of course, is that this administration has not yet demonstrated an interest in humane and workable alternatives. The good news is that alternatives do exist. Based on experience and research, it is far from clear that draconian measures, such as those being employed by the administration, deter asylum seekers seeking refuge. And more significantly, research also suggests that alternatives to detention for asylum seekers are more economical, more humane, and can be developed and administered in ways that create high likelihoods that asylum seekers appear for hearings about their status. Thus, as difficult as these issues may be, they can be addressed without perpetuating and perpetrating injustices on asylum seekers and their children. In our recent report, we asked the administration to take a broad range of measures that would move us in the right direction. We urged the president and his administration to end the practice of turning away asylum seekers at ports of entry, to devote substantially greater political will and resources to uniting families torn apart through family separation, and as an act of basic decency, we urge the administration to direct that family members victimized by the separation policy may remain in the United States or re-enter the United States if they have already departed, pending a permanent legislative remedy for this population that provides a pathway to application for permanent residence. We also urge that they reject the replacement of a family separation policy with a family detention policy, and to investigate and hold accountable the conditions in detention centers and hold accountable those who are responsible for abuses. If implemented, these and other measures would offer the prospect of a brighter future for many thousands of asylum seekers, tens of thousands of asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle. They would also be a better reflection of the values that our immigration and refugee policies should represent. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Kraft, and I'm here for the kids. So we're going to talk about immigrant child health, and I'll start this off with the idea from the American Academy of Pediatrics that we speak for children. We look at issues with the lens of children because we know that our kids live in Republican and Democrat and independent households, and we are nonpartisan, but we are unabashedly pro-child. And our science and talking points and policy is all related to the best evidence that's out there in terms of what's best for children. So back in April of 2018, I was asked by some of our pediatricians who worked at the border to come down and see what was going on, because they said that even though the administration is saying there's no family-child separation, it's happening. We're seeing it happen here. And so I went down and got to tour one of the shelters that was run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this was one of these tender care, tender age shelters. And when I went in there, it was not the detention centers or the cages that you saw on TV. It was much more homey. But I walked into the toddler room, and any of you who've been around toddlers know that they are rambunctious and they're loud and they're playing. And this room had 15 toddlers in them, and most of them were absolutely silent. I mean, eerily silent, except for one little girl who was just crying and sobbing uncontrollably. Nobody could comfort her. There was a staff member next to her who was trying to give her toys and trying to give her books and trying to comfort her, but the staff are not allowed to pick these children up and hold them or comfort them. And you could just see what was going on in this room. You could see that these children needed something that none of us could give them, their parents. And what that does to a child and their brain is now well understood by advances in science and developmental neurobiology. So we know that stress response system, the stress that increases our cortisol, our epinephrine and norepinephrine, our fight or flight chemicals, is something that happens to us when we're stressed. And with a child, having that parent, that one adult who's caring in their life, helps to modulate these stress hormones, helps to decrease their level, and actually builds resiliency in their brain. But when these stress hormones are unopposed by a loving parent, a loving caregiver, that stress hormone is unbuffered, we know that it causes disruption in the synaptic connections in the brain. It keeps a child from developing speech and language, gross motor function, and social emotional bonds. And we actually know that this disrupts the architecture of the developing brain. And that's what I saw in the shelter. I saw these little children who were, some of them who were not even verbal yet, who were separated from their parents, and we saw what was happening because of toxic stress that was impacting their brain and their brain development, and the shock of all that was happening. So we know that separating parents from children is not a great idea, but science tells us that this is actually child abuse because we're impacting the development of these children's brains. And so I wrote an op-ed that appeared in the LA Times in early May about separating parents from kids at the border and how it contradicts everything we know as pediatricians that we do to build child health and not disrupt child health. And this got a lot of attention in the mainstream media and popular press. And so I actually got a call. Let's see if this will work here. I was at...
Hello, Dr. Kraft. It's Oprah Winfrey calling.
So I was in the office seeing kids in the sun.
Article.
And what Oprah did was this. She actually called Gail King at CBS this morning, who then called me and said, I want you to come down to the border and talk about this in front of the Ursula Processing Center where parents and kids were separated. So we did that. And again, talked about the science and toxic stress and why this is something that is really abusive to these young children. And that week, I had 55 interviews, everywhere from CNN, PBS NewsHour, Al Jazeera, the BBC, to talk about the science of toxic stress and what it does to the developing brain. And I think that led a lot of the public outcry onto why this should be stopped and that we need to stop this because, again, we were talking about the kids. You know, immigration is such a divisive topic that we need to focus on what's right for the population of people, and the American Academy of Pediatrics will do this for children. So some of the concerns that we've got continuing, reunifying all these separated children with their parents. We know that there are a number of these families who were told that their children would be given back to them if they refuted their asylum claim. And so they gave up their asylum claim because they wanted their children back. They were then deported and their kids are still here in the United States. That's a problem. Trauma-informed care for children reunited with parents. We know that many of these kids who are coming back to their parents are really different kids. And we know that the science tells us that the younger a child is, or the longer that separation, that will impact what that child's reaction will be coming back. And so we know trauma-informed care can help this reunification be something that works and positive for both the traumatized parent and the child. Integrating children and families and applying lessons learned from other countries. There's a global refugee crisis going on right now, and we know from countries like Greece and Turkey that you can assimilate these children and families into your population and do that successfully. And these are countries with far fewer resources than the United States. But there are lessons learned out there on how you bring these kids together into your country and make them part and parcel of who builds this country and doesn't disrupt it. Asylum and housing in community-based settings versus detention centers. Our policy is very clear at the American Academy of Pediatrics that keeping children in detention centers is wrong, is traumatizing. There's not enough food or water or sanitary conditions. Lights are kept on for 24 hours a day. These children do not have the right legal representation. I was told by some of our pro bono attorneys that these children are given a piece of paper with the names of pro bono attorneys that they can call to help represent them in immigration court. We're talking 2-year-olds who are given this. And I got to see an immigration attorney talk to a 3-year-old about know your rights and try to explain that to them. That's insane. And we know it's not good for kids. Addressing the harms of deporting parents with U.S. citizen children. This brings the topic from what's happening at the border to what's happening in our communities, because what we know right now is that 1 out of 3 of our children in the United States live in families with mixed immigration status, which means somebody might have a green card or DACA or be undocumented. And these families are scared. They're scared to get the services that are needed for their kids who are citizens. The idea of public charge, which is that if a citizen child has services accessed for him or her and they have somebody with a mixed immigration status in their family, that person might be deported, is something that really is scaring our families. And right now we're already seeing kids drop from WIC rolls, from SNAP, from Medicaid, because families are scared. And that needs to change. And then finally, our dreamers, our DACA kids. We need to have justice for these kids. So many of these kids are actually building businesses and really building positive things in the United States. And so we need to show them that path for citizenship and look at justice for all of our children and families in the United States. And I'll just end with a letter that I got from a 5th grader. This says, "Dear President of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I think the world needs you now, especially the children. They've done nothing wrong. They're practically in jail because they're immigrants. It doesn't mean they should be treated differently. Be the change you want to see in the world." And if that can come from a 5th grader, that should be able to come from our national leaders. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to the School of Public Health for inviting me and putting me along such a distinguished panel here. I'm very excited to be here today. I kind of wanted to feed off of the previous presentations a bit and talk a little bit about how we got here. Kind of follow up on Josh's original statement, and focus more on how it is we're getting to this point and what mechanisms are being utilized to essentially torture our community the way it is. The fundamental person responsible, in our estimation, for the implementation of a lot of these policies, and it may not be a surprise to you all, but is Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Now, this is an individual who sometimes, especially recently, has gotten a little bit of a reprieve in the media. He's even being shown as being a hero resisting Trump, because Trump consistently comes out and tweets against him or makes fun of his ears or whatever he does in his own kind of way. But always remember that this individual is primarily responsible for not only implementing these policies, but also creating them. Jeff Sessions has had a long history of being in the anti-immigrant fringe of his own party. It's actually, he was actually amazed when he was nominated for Attorney General. This was something he was not expecting. He even thought that he knew he was in the fringe of these beliefs and these policies. And lo and behold, now he's in the position to carry out these policies. And the Department of Justice in of itself, we hear a lot about the Department of Homeland Security, of course. We hear a lot about ICE. We hear a lot about all these other government institutions that carry out immigration policy. But the number one agency responsible for implementing and carrying all these out is the Department of Justice. And what we're seeing today will have long-term effects, even post the Trump administration, that we have to be aware about and we have to be smart about reversing. Just to let you know, just a couple of things that kind of even surprised me when I was first looking into them, right? Is the role of the Department of Justice in the immigration context. Illegal entry makes up the majority of federal convictions in this country. So forget about drug arrests, forget about corruption arrests. Illegal entry is the number one leading conviction that federal prosecutors go after and comply with. So federal prosecutors develop their success rates based on the number of people they can convict of illegal entry. Now that has a number of impacts in over the long term. That illegal entry that an individual is then stamped with now prevents them from accessing justice in a whole variety of ways. And what we're seeing nowadays is we're seeing an administration who, the previous administration had focused in on prioritizing immigration enforcement, right? You all are probably familiar with this, but the Obama administration, they were even criticized by organizations such as ourselves for deporting over 2 million individuals, but they did have a stack of priorities. They did prioritize their enforcement on individuals with some criminal backgrounds. Now, a lot of the times that criminal background included DUIs, right? And I'm not going to pull anybody in this room, but sometimes we've all made mistakes and have driven under the influence, and that has been used the excuse sometimes to deem an immigrant as criminal. But this administration has gone beyond that in such an unprecedented way, to such extent that they're not even looking at DUIs. DUIs used to be an easy way to flag immigrants. Now they're not even looking at DUIs. We've seen over the past year a tripling in the number of immigrants that have been arrested that have previous 0 convictions, including even DUIs, even the most minimalist of those offenses. And also their persecution of family, what they call family units, has also skyrocketed. Border Patrol over the past month it just put out a report saying they have a 40% increase in the number of family units that they have arrested. Those are mothers with children, parents with children, right? So we're seeing an unprecedented increase in the number of folks that are being arrested right now with zero previous criminal background, and individuals, including children, they have no possibility to have a previous criminal background, right? Now, how does this impact how DOJ goes about doing their job? Well, Sessions himself knows that he can't arrest his way towards a mass deportation, which is actually what, I mean, let's be honest, that's what he is trying to create a system to accommodate for. The number of arrests that no matter how many people he arrests, he still has to put those people through the judicial system, right? The court system. Fortunate for him, Department of Justice oversees the immigration courts, right? This is not a separate entity that will be judging these individuals. The immigration courts are going to be, are basically judges appointed through the Department of Justice and under the policies that he himself institutes. So what has he really been doing over the past couple of years? Well, he's really been leaning a little bit on the scales of justice and making it increasingly more difficult for immigrants to win their cases. One set example is he's putting quotas for judges to make sure that they close out their cases. We know right now that there's a huge backlog in immigration courts, in the immigration court system, and there's various ways to try to increase efficiency there. But what we're seeing him do is create a quota system for the judges, creating incentives for them to close out cases, a certain number of cases during the year. Right now, what we know through leaked evidence is that quota is somewhere around 700 to 1,000 cases a year. Think about that. Think about that in the context of what types of immigrants are coming to this country today, right? Again, these are people that are coming without documents, people seeking asylum, coming from countries basically that cannot support them in their own country. Refugees, in other words, and cases that are being expedited through the immigration courts in the matter of hours. I mean, you all know the Manafort trials, right? Are taking forever. That's one individual. These individuals are being tried at such an expeditious, at such a rapid pace that, again, situations where children are being put in front of a judge, the judge is ruling on these cases, and those cases are being closed automatically. One thing that's very important to also remember is in the immigration context, and a person that's being prosecuted by the government does not have the right to counsel. They do not have access to public counsel. So this creates situations where, again, you may have children that are 3, 4, 5 years old before an immigration judge without even an attorney to ever represent them in their case. And that is completely legal and completely justified, right? Other examples we're seeing in part of the Department of Justice is they're also trying to restrict what asylum looks like. They're trying to restrict domestic violence and and being subject to gang violence as a means under which you can apply for asylum. So this these restrictions against applying for asylum, and the majority of folks that we're seeing cross the border are individuals that are fleeing violence from their countries. They're not able to submit that as evidence in a hearing applying for their asylum. So again, rapidly increasing or rapidly decreasing their ability to find a positive judgment. And we're seeing this on and on. Also, Attorney General Sessions has also decided that a judge cannot close a case unless a deportation order is issued or unless he issues relief. We've seen a number of cases where cases are closed because lack of evidence by the prosecution or what have you, but now judges are not allowed to close cases unless they have a definitive deportation order issued or they've issued relief to that individual. And what type of relief are they going to be able to issue if these individuals cannot even apply for asylum under the circumstances under which they're applying, right? So this is heavily influencing the way that justice is done in this country, right? When you have the combination of all those factors, you're finding something really tantamount to discrimination against people of other countries that are coming to this country, right? That is completely opposed to what the foundations of the country are. So what can we do about this, right? The federal government cannot act in isolation in the implementation of all these immigration laws. They also need to rely, in some instances, with local and state government. We may not have control of the federal government right now, but you all have access to your own state and local governments, and that's where we can make a difference. There's different initiatives that we can all work on to try to stem the tide here and try to increase the capacity of these individuals to access justice. There's programs to try to create, and this is what we're doing at CASA, is trying to create programs where we get the state and local government to fund legal representation programs. Now, it's not a heavy burden for the local government to take on to fund some limited legal representation for these folks. The number of cases that the evidence is just overwhelming in terms of seeing how many people actually get positive immigration results when they're represented, as opposed to those who are never represented, right? There's different trust acts that you can also push your local government and local state and local government to enact. And what are those trust acts, or what are those policies? We call them trust because that is creating more trust within our immigrant and local communities. Trust acts are essentially limiting the cooperation that local and state government has with the federal government. Now, this is not in violation of any constitution, any laws, any regulations, anything. But we all know that our local police sometimes informs when we have seen multiple cases of this in Maryland and Virginia. Sometimes we have the local police see a person of color and automatically assume it's an individual, it's an immigrant, or it's an undocumented immigrant. And regardless of their violation of that law, may be calling immigration to come and pick them up, or at least to screen them. We can create policies to limit those violations of racial profiling, and we can all work together to kind of create those different policies. I know I'm over time, and I'd love to talk to you all about other questions you might have about this, but I think it's really important to know that this policy, this family separation policy, does not exist in isolation. It is but one, and what you've heard already, it is but one piece of a larger system that's being put in place that doesn't automatically go away when that one person in the White House goes away, or even when Jeff Sessions goes away. It's important to know that these are policies, and these are different policies that will live long after these individuals. But it's up to us to figure out a way to stop them and create a system where we can all access justice in the same way. So thank you so much for your time.
Great. Well, we're bringing up my slides. I noticed, Colleen, that you had a fifth grader who was quoting Gandhi, and we have an extra space at the Masters of Public Health for that person. Okay, let's see. I'm going to see if this will work. It will. So I'm going to play a very short video, 31 seconds, that I took. It will not be winning any Oscars. But I want to show you, this was in 2015 when I was on the beaches in Greece with UNHCR.
Yeah, that's good.
Firstly, just seeing the people coming over and thinking, of, particularly in Germany at that time, that it opened the borders, and thinking how lucky Germany was to be getting these people. Spoke to many of them. These were a mixture of people primarily seeking asylum. There were clearly some people amongst them that were economic migrants. But I didn't envision certain outcomes that have come after this. Sorry, I want to just show you this person. So this person came off, and this is a Red Cross worker. And I just remember, I was very close to him, and I just want to show you his eyes, the sorrow of his eyes. And these eyes, I must say, have haunted me for many years. And I want to now, as I move forward, I want you to think about this person and the benefits that these people are receiving in Europe. And I will bring it back to global health and to, oops, sorry. That's not going to work. Let me see if I can go up. Yeah. Okay, it's missing my points there, but that's not a problem. This is also now a picture of Venezuela and what's happening amongst these groups. And I want to point out just a couple things that my slides are missing. Number one is, as Eric and others said, everyone has a right to seek asylum, fleeing persecution. That right is not being given to many of the people at the border at this point. But there is a whole other issue that we need to talk about, which is economic migration. And that is much more complicated. But I would also posit that there is a mixture in many situations. There's a lot of what's called mixed migration going on. There are people that are fleeing gang violence, particularly in the Northern Triangle, where some will argue, and we'll see what this administration does, that that may not meet the definition of an asylum seeker or a refugee, despite the Cartagena Declaration, which shows that it does. But I never anticipated, when I saw that fellow's eyes and I saw these people coming over, and I was so grateful, and I was actually quite envious of Germany and Sweden that they're going to be getting all of these people that are going to be making their economy and diversifying. I never imagined what would be happening in the European Union, and never imagining the backlash that occurred in Europe, in Germany. And you see this right here. You see what's happening most recently in Sweden, but in particularly in Hungary and some of these other countries. Bringing it back to the US, I'm a Canadian, not an American. I don't think I was aware sufficiently of the divisions within this country at such a basic level. So I think for many of us who are non-Americans, to see what's happening now and to see all what's happening at these Trump rallies. But what has been vexing me, I would say, particularly at the school here, is that we're mostly talking amongst people that have similar views. And I would like to better understand what this person that's holding up "I'm ready to work" on the wall actually is thinking, and how we can try to look at some of our policies to try to figure out how we can explain better some of the issues that we've been trying to do today. So clearly, child separation, I mean, this is, our colleagues have mentioned, it's against the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's inhumane, it's wrong. Luckily, I would say across the divide, many people across the divide, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, recognize this. By no means not everyone, but a lot of people have recognized this. But there's a broader issue, and so what I'm going to read from some notes here, make sure I get it right. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the policies and how we craft our policies on hopefully evidence, but that actually may not fall out as intended. So there's no question that millions of refugees and economic migrants that flowed into Europe have had a negative political effect and brought more people, right-wing populism, into power that will have much further negative effects for the decades to come. And the anti-migration sentiment in the United States has skyrocketed. And together with, I think we need to consider the financial crisis of 7 and 8 and how that has affected the United States and basically brought Donald Trump into his presidency. But these issues led to child separation for the main reason, as our colleagues have said, to be a deterrent. And what's clear, and more data are coming out, it's not a deterrent. But these policies and these inhumane policies, we need to understand why some people are supporting them. So how does this relate to public health? As public health practitioners, my main point today is we need to think and we need to craft our policies according to evidence. We also need to consider the whole from mitigation to prevention to care in terms of our policies, and we must take into account human rights. But that's not enough. So we really have to consider the different parts of American society and the sentiments that people are feeling, and how our policies and what we are doing, and if we push too far, may actually have a reverberation that may be the opposite of what we wish to do. So public health in general and migration and humanitarian health in particular are inherently political, and it's something that we need to consider constantly. And so some of the things that we can do are to consider prevention. So if the US and other countries are going to continue to provide a high level of foreign assistance and promote economic policies that will benefit both countries, not putting on tariffs, then this actually may lead to less migration, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing, but may assuage some people within the United States. And if the assistance is used well, it may help public health sentiment. It may help the health of these people. And this may be some of the thinking that is going behind global health security and dealing with epidemics. It's a very small component. Secondly, we need to look at the response. And as some of the colleagues have mentioned, we need a common sense and humane immigration policy in this country, which includes dramatically increasing the judges, the immigration judges. This administration has actually made an effort not to do this. And we need a very clear, standardized and principled way, not, as George was saying, par hasard and just making decisions without sufficient evidence. But if we don't do this, we're going to be continuing to have more and more people in detention because their cases it's just taking too long for these cases to be resolved. And this will continue, particularly if children and families are put together, will have negative mental and physical health, aspects to children. And Colleen mentioned a lot of the mental health and the brain development. It also has, as we all know, some long-term, very negative physical aspects to these children. So in summary, our public health policies must be realistic. And we can't just be idealists and say this is the way it should be. We cannot just use evidence. We must use evidence to craft our policy, and we must consider what is just and humane. But we also have to take into account the unexpected consequences of our policies. And we really do need to think about, particularly in the US, the broad division of people and their sentiments to try to ensure that what we wish to recommend will not have negative effects that could last for generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the speakers. We are going to be collecting the cards now, so please pass them to the aisle. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Monica Vasquez-Guerrero to please do the honors of the first question.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Good. My name is Monica Guerrero Vasquez. I'm the representative of Centro Sol, the Center for Health and Opportunities for Latinos at Johns Hopkins. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you so much, learning from such a distinguished panel. Thank you so much for all your highlights and lessons that you shared today. I have a question, and I hope you help me clarify. How much has a judge a say on the kids who come in front of them? And I think George gave a couple of examples and about kids coming in front of a judge who are 2, 3, 4 years old. How much can a judge say about, this is not a case, I'm not gonna judge this kid? How much does that work? Can you explain a little bit? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think, so I know that's an example that we just kind of throw out there, right? Like for, to get folks' reaction about a 2 or 3 year old. I mean, you know, first of all, we got to realize judges are human beings as well. And the judge isn't going to immediately, the judge is going to do his best or his or her best to try to figure out a solution and a solution for that individual. What mostly happens in the immigration court context is when a minor comes before the judge, he allows for an extension for that individual, for the child, and hopefully that child may or may not have a sponsor, may or may not have a family member with them, to find legal representation. and in many cases does try to extend the case until such time as that child could secure some sort of representation. The problem that we're seeing now is that now that judge has other pressures, right? Now the Attorney General has created a quota for that individual judge to have a specific set number of cases concluded by the end of the year. And that's how his performance will be reviewed at the end of the year. So what we're seeing is all of these factors influencing the decision of a judge as to whether he's going to allow those cases to move forward. We've seen situations where these cases are closed and that individual child is ordered deported, and we've also seen cases, on the other hand, that the judge does try to work with other legal providers to match them with some sort of legal representation. Whether or not the case is successful is another standard, right? But I think what we're seeing is the problem that we're seeing is that these judges are now, whether they're decent human beings or not, we're seeing them being pressured by these other factors and these other policies that the Attorney General is imposing on them to try to move these people out of the court system and back to their own countries.
Great. Thank you. One of the themes of all of your presentations was about the fact that the problem isn't just family separation, and yet family separation, was the sort of issue that captured people's and really taken up a lot of the discussion. And I guess this is a question for any of you who are interested. Why do you think family separation became such an issue, and do you think that any of the response to that could translate to any of these other issues, such as the detention of children or the immigration system with the judges? Like, what caused the focus, and could it be translated?
I think the answer is empathy. I mean, I think that when the average American citizen who's not particularly political can see something that very graphically hits home, and some a sort of pain and suffering to which they can very much relate. I think that's what creates this sense of injustice, and I think that in fact is the challenge for advocates to really in the narratives to sort of personalize these these dramatic situations. So I think that really is the challenge, and it's a big challenge because there has never been the consensus, the American consensus on diversity, inclusion, tolerance, respect for the stranger, has always been a very, very fragile one throughout our history. And if you look at public opinion polling about immigration of Jews around World War II, or immigration of Vietnamese around the end of the Vietnam War, or emigration of individuals from the Balkans, there hasn't been overwhelming American support in the body politic for policies of generous policies of migration. So much of this has really depended on our political leadership, and so in that respect, we're in a particularly challenging time. And to me, that only underscores the importance of trying to make the case in ways that to which Americans can really relate.
I would say I think nobody wants to hurt children. None of us want to hurt children. And bringing family separation and the effects on what that does to children really put us into a place where I think everybody from both sides of the spectrum said, okay, this is wrong. We need to change it.
It was so egregious, I think, that it brought people's minds to be able to say this is wrong. One of the frustrations I find is that people do not really understand what's happening in the Northern Triangle, do not understand that people are actually fleeing and seeking protection. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there is a deliberate misinformation about people coming in gang people, insecurity, and also these are economic migrants. And this is, I still think it's a challenge for us, particularly with the internet and the cable news channels at this point, to get the right information to people who I do think would care, as they care about children, they would perhaps care about these people if they really had the right information.
And I would say, just from the advocate's perspective, I think it was, you hate to call it that because it's a harsh word considering the context, but it was an opportunity to engage the general public on immigration policy in general. I mean, I think when the policy was initially announced, forgot when it was, March or April, there was very little fanfare. It was mostly done, Sessions got up there, there was maybe a tweet by the president, and it was just seen as, oh, well, another one of his things, right? Slowly but surely, as the press got wind of the effects, now there started to be a real conversation about, for example, the Flores decision. I don't know how many of you know about the Flores decision now, but I guarantee it's a lot more than what the Flores decision was, in early January. And it's when you have those striking images that you start to ask questions and you start to say, why can I shoot somebody in the head and have a guaranteed right to legal representation, but if I cross the border, I'm not allowed the same opportunity, right? It's those, unfortunately, as I said, it's a harsh word to say when children are being separated from their parents, but it was an opportunity to engage a broader public. As Eric said, some non-political individuals didn't really see immigration as a key topic, but finally we had an opportunity to talk about the injustice of it all. And I think it's a continuing discussion that we're still having. Hopefully, if we continue to have these, we'll find a solution.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear from each of your perspectives, and very briefly, what do you think are the impacts or the different issues that local communities and families here facing these issues with the kids and families being detained and separated are? Can you explain a little bit, what are the issues that we're facing here locally?
I'll be brief because I already talked a lot. I mean, I think first of all, it's also shedding the light on the ancillary impacts of this trauma, right? It's lack of health and social service supports that exist for these families at the local level. We have to figure out a way in which, because believe it or not, this community, the Maryland, Northern Virginia area will and always will be a hub for people migrating from the Northern Triangle, from Central America, right? And we have a lot of those families that were separated with us here now, right? But we don't have access to a lot of the health and social supports, which is something that, for example, Monica and Josh's group is really digging deep and trying to figure out. And also, I think it also allows us locally to think about what can we do locally to try to, again, stem the tide and figure out how to reverse some of these decisions. As I said, locally, there's opportunities to create legal representation programs. You can't represent everybody, but if you represent a couple hundred people, you're going to make a huge difference, right? There's ways in which you can enact local policies in which you can limit federal interaction with local and state police and local enforcement. Federal enforcement, no matter what's going on at the federal level, who the leadership is, they got the resources. Let them do whatever it is they're going to do, but we can limit how they access our local resources, which are in our own control. So I think, again, it's an opportunity to ask questions, to figure out what is really happening, what are the impacts at the local level, and what kind of changes we can institute here locally to try to create a change.
So I think from what we see in the pediatric community, it's fear. And in our offices, we see the kids who don't want to go to school because they're afraid their parents aren't going to be home when they get home from school. We see the kids who are not signing up for their WIC and Medicaid services because their parents are afraid that somebody in the family is going to be found out and deported if they go and access those services. So we're seeing impacts on our U.S. citizen children because of these policies and because of the fear that's been generated by them.
You know, it's important to note that local officials at the state and more significantly at the municipal level have had a very different approach on these issues than political leaders at the national level, in part because they have to deal with these realities, and including the reality of not being able to call on the immigrant community to report crimes, to report situations of distress, to have normal relationships with law enforcement when those communities are in fear. It's also based on an appreciation at the municipal level, at local levels, that immigrants and refugees have been a tremendous source of strength, and in many cases have revitalized communities around the country. So we really see that distinction, and it's very significant. So what can you do? I think you can, number one, volunteer your time and energy to support immigrant and refugee communities in your areas. But I think, as importantly, get involved in politics and at the national level, and make it clear to your political leaders that you support, this isn't a partisan comment, I hope it's not, that you support elected officials who support, who endorse rational immigration and refugee policies that are informed by evidence. And I think that sort of effort is really critical. It's really critical because it is members of Congress who have some capacity to stop some of the most nefarious actions that are taking place on the national level right now.
On the point of evidence, we have some questions about what evidence would be useful for this discussion. What evidence, Dr. Kraft, would you like to have at the ready when you're getting questions on national TV? Is it, what evidence would help people see the issue as broader than family separation? We question about, for example, is there evidence about the conditions in detention broadly, other than stories or different cases that come up? Any thoughts on that question?
So there's a great deal of evidence, and much of it you can find in the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statements. We have one on detention of immigrant children, and the evidence looking at what the impacts of not enough food, water, poor sanitation, lights on 24 hours a day and disrupting circadian rhythm, and what that does for child health, and how that disinvestment in child health really hurts all of us and hurts all of our kids growing up there. The evidence that the fear that's been engendered in our immigrant community is actually spilling over to our kids who are not immigrants. So when you see your friends scared because they're not sure their parent's going to be home, what does that do to you? What does that do to all of our kids? So that evidence is out there, and the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statements on immigration are really a good source of some of the basic literature behind that.
I spent 6 years as dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where we have a joint MPP public health program, if any of you are interested, but I think probably not. And one of the critical issues there is what we call translational research, right? I mean, there is so much evidence on issues of relevance to this issue. The economic impact, the positive economic impact of immigration, the long-term positive benefits, economic benefits that has resulted from refugee admissions. There's a recent Urban Institute study on that very subject. The impact or the lack of impact of harsh measures at the border on the rate of efforts to seek asylum. the positive experiments on alternatives to detention. There is a bevy of research there. I think the challenge for those in the academy, especially in places like a School of Public Health or a School of Public Affairs, is to figure out how to translate that research into understandable, compelling narratives that can actually impact the policy discussion and policy debate.
Yeah. Just putting on my epidemiological hat, there are certain indicators that I think may be difficult to get because the government may hold them. But there's a lot of discussion about the government saying that the people must, before they cross the border, come to the border and declare that they're seeking asylum. But it would be very interesting to know how many people do this, and then what is the weight, what happens to them, what is the danger, and therefore how many have to move across the border to be able to do this. And then I have mentioned to Colleen that I think it would be extremely important to try to follow up with these children that have been separated, the effects on their families, the families and the children themselves, to do more of a prospective study to be able to document this both short and long term.
Thank you. So I have a few cards that are related to the same question about and on the same lines about evidence, and it's training. How can we approach educating our professionals, health, public health, and also judges and legal support professionals to be ready to address these crises?
I can perhaps just start a bit in terms of, one would be to hold seminars such as this. But I do think that we at the school, but across the board, need to be thinking a little bit more, moving away from some of the didactic way that we are teaching and trying to be doing two broad things. Number one is bringing these different groups together, the judges, the doctors, the populations affected, would be extremely helpful. And there are ways to be able to do this. And then the other way would be trying to, again, bring in more of the disparate views of people, particularly those that we don't agree with. And I'm still, as I keep on harping on, there's not an easy way to do this, but I think, looking at Josh as the Vice Dean, that there must be ways that we can do this. And, I did talk to Josh before and to say maybe we should have invited, if someone would have come, a very different view of this problem. And I think we should try to do that in the future.
Anyone else want to comment on that question? Training
I
PD?
think
Yeah.
Just to, I completely agree with that view, and I think it's something that even for someone like me, and even for somebody with the background that I do, you won't find me sitting next to a Trump supporter anytime soon. But at the same time, I think it is very important to hold those discussions and really understand the root of those the root of those thoughts. And I think, one of the but also on the other hand, I think there is a lot of work still to be done in putting those professional groups together. We have seen, even at CASA, we had a variety of different discussions. Once, about a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to actually engage a group of immigration judges. And we were able to put them with a group of our leaders, a group of directly impacted family members, to talk about the reasons why they came to this country in the first place, right? Sometimes we forget that, with the title of judge, the accomplished, background that the individual has, and the title that they have, the responsibilities they have, they're fundamentally human beings, right? And they're still restricted in the type of information that they sometimes have. And being able to put these different groups together to really understand each other is something I think that is going to be really helpful in figuring out a way forward. Now, I do caution in that, I think there's this administration and this campaign and this presidency was really founded on a base that sees themselves as being threatened by people like me, like us, like people of color. They do want to go back and they feel themselves, they want to go back to some sort of, that's why his campaign theme talks about going back into some theoretical past when things were better. It's very hard to have conversations when people fundamentally do not trust in your existence or your background. So but in order to move forward, there are barriers that we're all going to have to lower, including all of ourselves in the advocate community, to really figure out what the future really looks like.
I want to give each of you a chance for any final comments as we're wrapping up here about the challenge of not only family separations, but the many other issues that we've talked about that are affecting thousands upon thousands of children and families today in the United States. And what you think the most important thing for people here to be thinking about, and people who are watching on the webcast to be thinking about and doing to make a difference. Thank you.
So, go ahead.
Well, it's a hard question. And I think we've talked about a lot of it already. I think being involved in your communities is very important. I think being involved in political activism or advocacy at the national political level is also important. But I also believe in this particular moment, the groups that are, doing the most on the policy level to prevent the very most egregious abuses against asylum seekers are the groups that are engaged in litigation, because the policy environment is so poor right now for legislative action or administrative action at the federal level. There's just nothing going on at that level, which does not mean people should not continue to advocate, but in terms of the real achievements that are being made, they're being made by the groups that are challenging these government actions in the context of litigation, the ACLU in particular, and many others. So in a declaration against interest, because I run a policy advocacy organization, I would say that your checks to organizations like the ACLU, to my mind, is money well spent.
I would say locally within your communities, do what you can to meet the needs of your families in a way where you can co-locate resources and maybe have somebody from the WIC office or the Medicaid office come to your practice or your clinic and work with some of your families that you identify are afraid. But I think for all of us, the bigger policy questions on this are things that you can affect on November 6th. Get out and vote. Get your parents to vote, get your kids to vote, get your colleagues to vote, and give the message that we are not going to tolerate this type of bigotry and racism. America is better than this, and our kids need us.
So representing an organization that's 6 different lawsuits against Trump, but thank you, Eric, for that shout out. So, I mean, and I just want to reiterate that, what we're trying to convey is I think what's important is that you take action, right? I think a lot of this is very frustrating. I mean, I could imagine for a lot of folks, again, if this is not in your, immigration is not necessarily in your wheelhouse, it could be overwhelming if you're on the progressive spectrum, if you're on the, even if you're in the middle, even if you're on the right, seeing children being treated like this goes against what we all believe this country to be, right? It is very frustrating, but I think, sometimes when we get that frustrated, we tend to go off in our corners. I'm, of course, I've done this. I mean, no doubt all of you have at some point, and you start to just vent in your own echo chambers, but that's not really going to do anything. It's important to engage your representatives at every level. It could be at your city council, it could be in your town council, your state delegates, your state senators. There's multiple levels, your congressmen. As I said before, there's things that can be enacted at the state and local level. And these go far beyond feel-good measures, right? Because some of us say, well, that's not going to happen in my town. That's not going to happen in my community. No, these are real policies and actions you can do to make you can push your representatives to create real change in your local municipality. And when we all come together and do that collectively as a nation, that's when we're going to see the change at the federal level. And of course, you know, and again, to reiterate, there's a hugely important midterm election that's coming up in November. I know a lot of you as well, maybe many of you live in Maryland. You're like, Maryland, we're fine. We're you know, we're mostly whatever, blue. Still, this is not a red and blue subject, and trust us, trust me, we've talked to many people that play blue and still do not see things the way I think many of you see them. It's important to engage those members, regardless of what party affiliation they have, and hold them accountable.
Paul?
Unfortunately, I can't vote. But I agree I mean, I'll say be very quick and I won't repeat, other than to say I've been very impressed by the resilience of the legal system. And so what Eric was saying, and particularly the ACLU and others, has been extraordinary. I would suggest the following, is that what's happening in America, child separation is unique. There's no other country that I'm aware of that actually has done that. And that's just wrong and against everything that is good in the world. But what is happening in America in terms of immigration, in terms of the nativism and populism, is not unique to America. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in many, many other countries. And so I think it behooves us to actually try to understand, and it's going to be hard, but try to really understand why this is happening and what are the failures of our policies that have actually allowed this to happen, and how can our policies take into account this so we can address this in the future.
Well, please join me in thanking this terrific panel for the work they do on this issue. Thank you so much for coming today.